A beautiful community. You know, the neoliberal narcissism of a mock kink party in Moscow has triggered a new level of repression in Russia and also a new level of mobilization, cultural mobilization, because we often talk about economic mobilization, military mobilization, political mobilization. And that's all connected with a quite hilarious, incredibly indulgent party in the showbiz world of Moscow. So we'll talk about that. But we're now in the period between Christmas and New Year. I want to send you all of my love. This is, on the one hand, a trite chat, but it's also got depth to it, because in a way it'll show us the extremity of Russia, but also some of the things that in intensified form can tell us about us ourselves. Those of you who had a wonderful Christmas, I'm so happy about that. And those of you who have struggled, I'm sending you my love, and I hope the New Year period will be tolerable if Christmas was difficult. But for everybody else, I hope you're having a really wonderful time with loved ones. And it's a privilege to be with you again. I partly thought my health is not compatible with it at the moment of actually doing this chat on the main channel, but we're just going to do it here instead, because I think there are some interesting takeaways here, despite the triteness. So let's start with triteness. So what actually happened? Well, there was a Russian pop celeb party in a club called Mutator in Moscow, and lots of people there who are famous in that country. And those of you who follow Russia more closely may even be familiar with some of the names. They include Ksenia Sobchak, the singer, actress Lolita, who's always had quite nasty views about Ukraine, and Philippe Kirkorov, and Nastya Ivleeva, who's a huge celebrity in Russia, who was the host of this thing. And I think there was a series of parties Ivleeva had that had various kinds of themes. And the theme for this party was almost naked. And the idea was that you come either scantily dressed or dressed in a way that implies the idea of being scantily dressed. And the whole thing, to me, actually probably feels like it was more repressed and conservative than it might seem. In other words, the extremities of it were there for the cameras. It doesn't seem to me necessarily the case that people went utterly crazy in that event. But it was a bunch of scantily dressed Russian showbiz folks combined with a lot of footage being taken both privately by these folks, but also with media being there intentionally. We'll come to that later. So I don't believe the idea that the footage was leaked out. The whole idea was to film this thing, it seems to me. And I would define it as kind of a mock kink event. So the point was the irony of it. So it was sort of a play on an orgy party, but the point is that it's not one. It's just an ironic take on that. Maybe very unimaginative, but that's what it was. A couple of the highlights are, I think, Ivleeva herself turning to the camera and saying, "Have you ever seen a bottom dressed in a 23 million ruble piece of jewelry?" I think that's $250,000. That's who displays that piece of jewelry. And there was also a child there, some kind of rapper who is apparently 20 years old, 21 years old. And he was wearing nothing except a sock, an expensive sock, actually. I looked it up, $150 sock. And that was the only thing he was wearing, and he was wearing that on his genitals. After that happened, and images of that were flying around the internet, the original reaction of the stars was, whatever, you got a problem with that, suck it up, as Z rage began to build up on social media. Ivleva said the next morning, if we never disapprove of each other, we will expire out of mundaneness. And Ksenia Sobchak, who most of you probably know because she's had a political role in Russia, she said, excuse me, where people take their naked butts is up to them. The world is unjust, and it'll always be so. Somewhere people are being killed. Somewhere children are starving. And somewhere, at the same time, people are sipping champagne. No state of national mourning can last forever. The regime's response to the pro-war camp ventilation about this on social media was at first sort of uncertain. They didn't jump on it straight away. But eventually things began to move. Vasio, this rapper with a $150 sock, was given 15 days arrest for mild hooliganism, prison sentence 15 days, and 200,000 ruble fine for propaganda of non-traditional norms. And he's been going around explaining how heterosexual he is ever since. A lot of these people are having concerts cancelled, and not from the regime itself. They're receiving plenty of physical threats. And Ivleva herself is now potentially being persecuted for various kinds of tax issues, fabricated or real. The reaction of the stars eventually changed. Don't worry, we'll get through the triteness and get some real analysis out. The reaction of the stars changed, and then they shifted to deep apologies, how inappropriate, how unacceptable of us on reflection. The event accidentally got out of control. We're going to give money to charity. We're patriots, and we regret aspects of what happened. Philippe Kirkorov was seen with Peskov, Putin's spokesperson, apologizing, saying completely implausibly, given the images that came out, that I was so shocked as soon as I came in. I couldn't believe what was happening inside, and so I left. I mean, obviously not straight away, but it was just really, I couldn't believe my eyes, really, to be honest. I didn't even know really why I ended up there, but, you can, And then he released a semi-hostage looking video from a place that didn't look like his house or his office. Maybe it was the office of some kind of political figure in the country, issuing an apology. Sometimes you walk through the wrong door, he said. Dima Bilan, a pop singer, I think he did Eurovision years and years ago. He said the whole thing doesn't represent me, and I love my country. The singer, actress Lolita, said that it seems that the number of people who didn't like this gathering, which was ironically and only ironically called naked, is quite a lot of people, but we all make mistakes and so on. And Sobchak, who said, I can take my bottom anywhere, then said, now that I have reviewed the images from the event, I have come to consider the event inappropriate. And then Ivleeva released a video begging for forgiveness, saying she's ready for any kind of punishment. And indeed, it looks like she may be a victim of various processes now. So is it possible that somebody, not necessarily Putin or Patrushev, but somebody quite a bit below them, saw this and was mortally offended? Possible, but highly unlikely. I mean, this is a regime whose conservatism is so spectacularly fake that it's very difficult to take it seriously. I mean, as you might have seen in images going around the internet, these are people who have striptease poles in their palaces. So what on earth happened? Well, it seems to me that most plausibly there was an organic reaction that was then picked up, or was indeed partly triggered, by a prudent decision by the regime to exploit the situation. And so how do we understand this? Well, we just made a couple of distinctions already. One's between a kind of a depth of repressions and the width of repressions. What has been happening over the last few months in Russia since the war, since the brutal invasion of Ukraine, is a deepening of repression. So those who are enemies of the regime are being pursued more deeply. So they've had some stuff hung on them already, various labels of foreign agents or terrorists and so on. That has been deepened. But what hasn't been happening so much is a widening of repression that expands to people who are not obvious opponents of the regime. This is one such small move, however. And here is a sort of weak prediction. Repressions in Russia will be widening, not just deepening, and increasingly people who do not oppose the regime will be on the wrong end of them unless they positively support the regime, right? So we're talking about this pendulum of depoliticizing versus politicizing dynamics. In the case of the showbiz world, the Kremlin has abjectly failed. And often it's an exaggeration when people say something's an abject failure. But the reality is that when we make this further distinction between mobilization economically, mobilization militarily, mobilization politically, but then a fourth category, if you like, mobilization culturally, in that cultural bit, the Kremlin's attempts at mobilization have been weakest because they have not managed to convince, with the exception of a very small number of special characters, they've not been able to convince pop stars to stand up for Putin's project and for Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine. So people have been hiding. People have been putting black squares at the beginning of the war on their Instagram, which means really no to the war. Some of them have taken it down. Some of them have kept it up. Since this party, Ivleeva took hers down and put it back up again. But they've not been able to get people on board. People are saying, no, we don't want to star in your pro-war TV series. No, we don't want to do this or that concert. So if you like, the showbiz world in Russia best fits with the depoliticized blob in the middle, not with the pro-war or the anti-war group. But it's more anti-war than the typical representative of the depoliticized blob, simply because these are folks who often speak English. These are folks who spend time in Paris, Rome, New York, London historically. And these are people who often have residences in other countries, allows them access to the West. And I mean, they just cannot be seriously persuaded that what Putin's doing is remotely sensible. But they're not opposing Putin. because they're afraid of losing their careers, they're afraid of various consequences. And the regime has simply failed to excavate them out of that state of political retreat, very careful and very deliberate political retreat. And they're trying, and they're pissed off about this. They're really pissed off about this. So this is part of this story. I think there is even another element here, and that is that even though the preponderance of Russian celebs don't speak out directly against the war, they do kind of manifest themselves directly against the traditional values narrative, quite obviously. This is a sort of thing that the party like that shows. Let's now, having said something about the widening of repression and having said how the Kremlin is pissed that it's not managed to mobilize the entertainers, the highly paid and famous entertainers in society, to take part in its project, let's take some broader lessons away. And there are 2 or 3 questions I'm going to leave aside. One is whether it's morally decent to party indulgently when your country is doing something terribly bad politically. And how much in a situation like that should you invest in the political process, especially if this is a complete disaster, not just for others outside your country, but for your country too. I want us to be careful, actually, not to think the answer to that question is obvious, because we could be throwing bricks in glass houses. Now, is it in bad taste in general? Imagine that this happened in Switzerland, let's say, and not in Russia. Here I want to recommend us away from being a prude and judge it on how imaginative or unimaginative it was, or how indulgent or unindulgent it was, beyond just the facts of its indulgence, the material facts of its indulgence. Is there something ridiculous, another question I'm going to leave, in how seriously these people take themselves, even when they talk about the sort of they talked about the art project that was the dress code for this party, which was going to culminate in particular kind of photography of these dress pieces, blah, 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 blah. And was also going to involve a lot of older people scantily dressed and maybe tackle ageism in the way we think of sexuality, blah, 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 blah. I wouldn't engage in that, but we do have a big problem with people who do certain kinds of work very successfully in the field of entertainment, taking themselves as seriously as though they were Giacometti or as though they were reinventing a more effective United Nations. So what's the real point I do want to focus on? I want to say that the combination, I think, of that kind of party in that kind of regime that's doing those kinds of things is a special instantiation of a kind of ethic of neoliberalism instantiated in an individual approach to life. So we're talking about how individuals go on. Now, neoliberalism isn't an ideology, it's not a political position, it's a magical commitment to the primacy of the market. That's to say, it's not a commitment which says I'm committed to it for these 7 reasons. It's a kind of a magical and often comically disproportionate commitment to the primacy of the market, whether it works to be committed to the market in a particular sphere or in a particular case or not. And so in this case, we're talking about certainly a gathering that involved a lot of folks with an enormous emphasis on the following values: wealth acquisition, power acquisition, personal success, and social recognition. Now, are these values bad? No, they're not. They can take various benign forms, but they become bad if they obliterate completely out of sight other contrasting or complementary values, such as a sense of one's responsibility or a sense of the public good, or justice, or a concept of authenticity that doesn't violently extract out of it a commitment to oneself as a social animal in an interdependent relationship with others. And this contrast of this expensive sock, the $250,000 piece of jewelry, with the directed self-immolation of the government of that country and of its project, is, I think, both an illustration of how far Russia is in a challenging place, but in a challenging place that is extreme but not unique. In other words, there's a lot of us in that image, right? A country is eating itself up into oblivion by trying to drag into that oblivion its neighbor, while we have the sock and we have the $250,000 piece of jewelry. That in constellation, and then the combination of the values that are driving the regime and the values that are driving that party, is an extraordinary, in an intense form, illustration of a kind of neoliberal value, ethic and practice that I think is also enormously powerful in our world too. It's just that in this case, Russia is an extreme case of what we have here at home. The only thing I need to observe at this point is that a lot of the individuals currently vying for political office in Western countries are themselves lopsidedly motivated by these values I listed, like wealth acquisition, power acquisition, building a personal brand, and fame. Lots of love and talk very soon.